Aston Martin's engine isn't just failing, it's destroying itself from the inside. We're talking about violent vibrations so powerful, they're killing the battery, shutting down performance, and even risking permanent damage to the driver's hands, all in just a few races. But here's what makes this unbelievable. Honda already knows what's happening. They've identified the failure. They've confirmed the damage. And still, they don't know why. Which means this isn't a normal problem. This is something deeper. A hidden flaw no one predicted, triggered only when the engine meets the car. Because the moment those two systems came together, everything started to break. And now the entire project is collapsing around it. So the real question is not how bad the problem is. It's how something this catastrophic was missed by everyone until it was already too late. To understand why this engine is destroying itself, you have to forget everything you think you know about engine failures. Because this isn't a broken part. It's not a weak component. It's not even a bad design. It's something far more dangerous. An interaction. Because the problem doesn't exist in isolation. The Honda engine, on its own, works. It produces power. It runs. It passes tests. But the moment it's installed into the Aston Martin chassis, everything changes. And that's where the real issue begins. Because inside that engine, there are tiny forces constantly moving. Pressure waves from combustion. Rotational forces from the crankshaft. Energy pulses traveling through the entire system. All of it, completely normal. All of it, expected. But in this case, those forces found something they shouldn't have. A match. Because every structure in the car has its own natural frequency. A specific vibration it responds to. Usually, those frequencies never align. They stay separate. Controlled. But here, they collided. The engine produces a vibration at a certain frequency, and the chassis of the car amplifies it. Not reduces it. Amplifies it. Which creates something known as resonance. And resonance is where small forces become destructive, because instead of canceling out, each vibration adds to the next, stronger, and stronger, and stronger, until the system can't handle it anymore. And that's exactly what's happening here. The Honda engine is generating the vibration, but the Aston Martin chassis is turning it into something far worse. A feedback loop, an invisible cycle that keeps building energy inside the car. And the first victim of that energy is the battery. Because the battery sits in one of the most sensitive areas of the car, right where those amplified vibrations are strongest. And under that stress, the internal structure begins to deform, microscopically at first, but enough to break conductivity, enough to create tiny failures inside the cells, until eventually, the battery just can't function anymore. And that's why this problem is so hard to fix. Because you're not dealing with one component, you're dealing with two systems that were never meant to behave like this together. Fix the engine, and you might lose performance. Fix the chassis, and you might destroy the entire aerodynamic concept. Change one thing, and it affects everything else. And that's why Honda's situation is so critical. They know what's happening. They can see the vibrations. They can measure the damage. But they can't isolate a single cause. Because the cause is the interaction itself. And that's what makes this one of the most complex failures in modern Formula One. Because it doesn't exist in one place. It exists in the connection between everything. And that's where the real problem begins to spiral out of control. Because once you understand this, you realize something even more worrying. This isn't just damaging the engine. It's compromising the entire car. And this is where the situation becomes almost impossible to escape. Because once resonance takes control, it doesn't just stay in one place. It spreads. Through the chassis. Through the suspension. Through every component connected to the engine. And suddenly, what started as an internal engine behavior becomes a full car problem. Because the AMR26 was designed around precision. Extreme precision. Newey built a car where every aerodynamic surface depends on stability. Clean airflow. Predictable ride height. Consistent mechanical behavior. But vibration destroys all of that. Because when the car vibrates, the airflow becomes unstable. The platform moves unpredictably. The suspension can't behave the way it was designed to. And that creates a second layer of performance loss. Not just from the engine, but from the entire car. And that's why the drivers feel it so clearly. Not just as discomfort, but as a complete lack of confidence. Because imagine trying to push a Formula One car to the limit, while the steering wheel is shaking in your hands. While the rear of the car isn't stable. While every input feels slightly delayed or exaggerated. That's not just slower. That's unpredictable. And in Formula One, unpredictable means dangerous. Which is exactly what Aston Martin admitted. The vibrations are not just technical. They are physical. They travel through the car, into the cockpit, into the drivers themselves, with the risk of long-term nerve damage if pushed too far. And that changes everything. Because now, this isn't just about performance. It's about limits. How long can they run the engine? How much power can they use? How many laps before the damage becomes critical? And that's why the team made one of the most painful decisions possible. They had to reduce power. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Running at full performance would destroy the battery in just a few laps. So they lowered the engine output, protected the system, and in doing so, sacrificed competitiveness completely. Because now, they're not racing at 100%. They're surviving at 70%. And in Formula 1, that difference is everything. It's the difference between fighting for points and fighting just to finish. Which explains the results. No points. Minimal running. Constant issues. A car that looks completely disconnected from its potential. But here's where it gets even more critical. Because even with all these emergency fixes, the core problem is still there. They haven't removed the resonance. They've only reduced its effect. Temporary solutions. Not permanent ones. And that leads to the most dangerous realization of all. Every race they run like this is not progress. It's damage control. Because the real fix, the one that actually eliminates the problem, would require something much bigger. A redesign of the engine, of the mounting, possibly even of the entire rear structure of the car. And that's not something you do mid-season. That's something you plan from the ground up. Which means, everything we're seeing right now is not a team trying to win. It's a team trying to survive long enough to reach a solution that doesn't exist yet. And that's where this story takes its final turn. Because once you realize they can't fix it in time, you start to understand why something even more drastic is already being considered. And that's where the story stops being about a problem and becomes about a decision. Because once you accept that the issue cannot be fixed quickly, you're forced to ask something much bigger. Do you keep fighting a losing battle? Or do you walk away early? And inside Aston Martin, that question is already being asked. Because every solution they've tried so far has only reduced the damage, not eliminated it. They changed the ignition mapping. They added damping between the engine and the chassis. They even modified how the battery communicates with the system, trying to protect it from failure. And it worked, partially. They can now finish races. They can keep the car running. But they cannot unlock performance. Because the moment they push harder, the vibrations return. Stronger. More destructive. Which means the limit is still there. Unavoidable. And that creates the ultimate ceiling. A car that physically cannot reach its potential. No matter what the drivers do. No matter what setup they try. No matter how perfect everything else is. And in Formula 1, a ceiling like that is fatal. Because development becomes meaningless. Why bring upgrades? If the core problem blocks all performance gains, why invest resources? If the result cannot change? And that's where the thinking shifts. From fixing to abandoning. Because the data is clear. Even if Honda finds a solution, it won't arrive in time. The regulation window delays any major engine changes. The redesign required is too deep, too complex, too slow, which means the season is already compromised. Not maybe, not potentially, already. And that's why the most shocking option starts to make sense. Walking away from the 2026 engine, stopping development, freezing the current concept, and redirecting everything to the next one. A completely new engine, a completely new approach, built with one goal: never let this happen again. Because what Aston Martin has right now is not just a performance problem. It's a structural failure. A mismatch between two systems that should have worked together, but didn't. And fixing that mismatch means starting from zero, which is exactly what they're now considering. And this is where everything becomes uncomfortable. Because abandoning a season is something Formula 1 teams almost never admit. But the signs are all there. Limited upgrades. Focus shifting behind the scenes. Decisions being made that prioritize the future over the present. And when that happens, the outcome is already decided. Not on track, but in strategy. Because now, Aston Martin is no longer racing to win. They're racing to understand. Collecting data. Learning everything they can from this failure. So that the next version doesn't repeat it. And that leads to the final truth of this entire story. This engine isn't just destroying itself. It's forcing one of the most ambitious projects in Formula 1 to reset completely. Because sometimes, the biggest failure is the only way to discover what actually needs to change. And right now, Aston Martin is learning that lesson in the most brutal way possible. And here's the part that changes how this entire story will be remembered. Because years from now, no one will talk about the vibrations first. They won't start with the failures. They won't start with the 0 points. They'll start with the decision that came after. Because this is the moment that defines projects like this. Not when everything works, but when everything breaks. And what you choose to do next. If Aston Martin commits to this reset, if they fully abandon the limitations of this engine, then what looks like collapse today becomes something very different. It becomes a foundation. Because every failure they're experiencing right now is data. Every vibration, every broken battery, every compromised lap. It's all information no simulator could ever reproduce. Because this problem only exists in reality. Only at full speed. Only under race conditions. And that means something important. They are learning faster than anyone else. Not how to be fast, but how to avoid being broken. And in Formula 1, that knowledge is just as valuable. Because the next engine, the next car, will be built with this exact failure in mind. The resonance will be avoided. The architecture will change. The integration between engine and chassis will be designed together from the very beginning. Not separately, not assumed, but controlled. And that's where Newey's influence becomes decisive. Because this is exactly the kind of challenge he understands. Not fixing what's visible, but redesigning what's fundamental. And if he applies that thinking to the next project, then this disaster becomes an advantage. A painful one, but a powerful one. Because while other teams are refining small details, Aston Martin could be preparing something completely different. A clean concept. A system designed without compromise. Built from the lessons no one else had to learn. But here's the risk. Because this only works if the next step is right. Not slightly better. Not competitive. Right. Because if they repeat the same mistake, if the integration fails again, if the new engine brings new unknowns, then this reset becomes a trap. Time lost. Momentum gone. Confidence damaged. And in Formula 1, those things are almost impossible to recover. Which is why this moment matters so much. Because it's not just about solving a problem. It's about choosing a direction. A path that defines not just the season, but the next several years. And that's why this story feels so different. Because we're not watching a team trying to climb the grid. We're watching a team deciding how to rebuild itself from the inside out. So in the end, the real reason the Honda engine is destroying itself is not just resonance, not just physics, not just a missed interaction. It's timing. A project that came together too late. An integration that wasn't fully understood. A system pushed into reality before it was truly ready. And Formula 1 punishes that instantly. But it also rewards those who learn from it. Which means the final answer to this entire story has nothing to do with what's happening now. It depends on what comes next. Because this engine may be destroying itself today, but it might also be building something far more dangerous for everyone else in the future.